G'day students. So what we've done so far in this chronic adaptations chapter is to look at aerobic and anaerobic training and the changes to the cardiovascular system, the heart, the blood, and the blood vessels. And just a quick summary reminder that the heart becomes stronger, the heart becomes bigger. The blood vessels capillary size increases and density increases. And it's all about being able to pump more blood around the body. The volume of blood increases, which means that the volume of red blood cells and the volume of hemoglobin increases. So all of this leads to the body's ability with the heart, the blood, and the blood vessels to be able to transport more oxygen around the body quicker and more efficiently. Today we're starting to discuss, actually we'll do the whole of the respiratory system chronic adaptations. So the respiratory system, just as a reminder to you, is this here. We're talking about the lungs and the airways and the breathing mechanisms within the body. So we've got the nose and the mouth, and we've got the nasal cavity down the back, and then we've got our pharynx, larynx, and trachea. And then as we go through here and have a little bit more of a detailed look at this, we break off into the bronchus and the bronchioles, and then we have our alveoli, which is the little air sacs at the end of that, and these big surface area organs here, these are the lungs. And I want you to pay specific attention as well to the muscle that is connected to the bottom here, which is your diaphragm. And it's the muscle that pulls down and up, which actually increases and decreases the volume inside the lungs, which draws air in and pushes air out, which is our breathing mechanism, which you can see here very quickly. We breathe in and we breathe out. We breathe in, diaphragm pulling, and we breathe out, diaphragm pushing. So what I'm going to take you through today are the changes that occur in that system, the respiratory system, the breathing mechanism, the process of bringing air in from outside the body, inside the body, and into the lungs. And a reminder that when we say air, we're referring to all of the gaseous elements that we breathe in. There might be some hydrogen, some nitrogen, some carbon dioxide, as well as oxygen. We don't just breathe oxygen in. Because if we're standing next to another human being who's just breathed out, they've breathed out a fair bit of carbon dioxide, as well as breathing out some excess oxygen and things that was residual within their lungs. And if we breathe that air in, that's what we're breathing in. And it's the job inside the lungs for the body to extract the oxygen, which is that alveoli place, and hold that oxygen so that when some blood is flowing past and there is some capillaries, which is one of those blood vessels, which is one cell thick walls, when that's next door to the alveoli, the oxygen can jump out of the alveoli and into the bloodstream, ready to be transported off to the rest of the body. Don't forget as well, when we talk about gaseous exchange or diffusion, the oxygen is leaving the lung site and going into the bloodstream, but quite often there's carbon dioxide that's coming out of the bloodstream and into the lungs, ready for us to breathe out when the diaphragm makes its next movement. So let's go through a little bit of this textbook here, and I've just got a few little reminders for myself and for you guys. The changes that you're going to be hearing about are aerobic changes, not anaerobic changes. So we're talking about training aerobically, so going through all of those aerobic training styles, not the anaerobic training styles. So if we were to train anaerobically, the only change you're going to see happen is that the diaphragm muscle itself will become stronger. Therefore, you are able to breathe a little bit stronger and more forcefully. But we're talking about the aerobic changes here. The other thing I want to make very clear is that the size of your lungs is finalized when you've finished your development as an adult. So don't expect, similar to the cardiovascular system, for any of these changes to mean that we can increase the size of our lungs. That is not possible. It's more about increasing the function and efficiency of the lungs and the breathing. So when we use the word pulmonary, we refer to breathing and the air mechanisms of coming into the body. So there's less adaptations here compared to cardiovascular, and these are aerobic training. And essentially what happens is greater amounts of oxygen are able to be taken into the body through air and breathing and used by the body. That's a summary of the changes in the respiratory system. More air comes in and is used. So if we have a look at this, we've got the structural and then we've got the functional changes as well. Structural is changes within the respiratory system. Functional is how they improve the respiratory system and functioning. So practically every volume within the lungs will increase apart from one of them, which is tidal volume. Now, if you're struggling with your definitions of tidal volume, lung capacity, vital capacity, etc., I would refer you to the back of the book or a simple Google search, and make sure that you do know what each of these things are: residual volume, vital capacity, reserve volumes, etc. A lot of them are referring to different types of breathing, whether it's a forceful breath in, whether it's a forceful breath out, whether it's a regular breath in, a regular breath out, whether it's a regular breath in and then you force your body to bring in more air, or whether it's a regular breath out and then you force your body to expel all of the air that you can get out of your lungs at any one time. They all have different names. And what you do is when you look at this is color coded. So as a colorblind person, I'm not much good to you going through this table, but essentially apart from tidal volume, everything will increase. And even though it might look like some of these color codings look like a very similar size, don't forget to look here that this scale goes from 0 to 6 and this scale goes from 0 to nearly 8. And so even you can see these dotted lines trying to line up. Each of these capacities will increase. So that's a really interesting thing to note here, is that every volume within breathing in, breathing out, extracting oxygen, etc., will all increase other than tidal volume. The other thing that's going to increase is diffusion. Now, diffusion is what I spoke about before, which is carbon dioxide coming out of the bloodstream and into the lungs, ready to be breathed out, and oxygen going from the alveoli at the end of the lungs into the bloodstream, ready to be transported down to the skeletal muscles. We know the changes already within the cardiovascular system with more capillaries, etc. However, with a greater surface area, what we're actually noticing is there is the ability for more oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange to be able to take place at both rest and submaximal and maximal exercise intensities. So that's really interesting because a lot of these changes, and you'll see in the summary table at the end, are either during rest or during maximal exercise, but sometimes they're decrease and sometimes they're increase. But what we need to understand here is that with more diffusion, you are going to be able to be a more efficient aerobic athlete because more oxygen will be traveling around the body. So it's not just wasted oxygen that we breathe in through air and it sits in the lungs. When we look at this, we need to understand, as I said, that there's a difference between air and oxygen. So when you breathe in larger amounts of air, subsequently you'll be breathing in larger amounts of oxygen. However, the body needs to be trained to be more efficient to extract those larger amounts of oxygen and actually use it. So this doesn't mean that somebody who is untrained, who forces their diaphragm to take deeper breaths, that is not going to functionally help them or assist them in being a better endurance athlete because they're just making a forceful deeper breath. What we need to understand here is that the body needs training about extracting that oxygen and using it as well. What that means though is if the body is more efficient, and I've used the word efficient a few times and I circled it here because I think it's such a powerful word when we talk about chronic adaptations. If the body is more efficient, then the body doesn't have to work as hard to supply the same amount of oxygen post-training as it did pre-training. So what I'm going to say here is if less oxygen is needed, I'll come back to that bit. There's another bit that I want to talk about. My apologies. Don't forget that the diaphragm is a muscle, and the diaphragm is the item that helps, it's the muscle that helps move the lungs down and up, therefore increasing and decreasing in its size on the inside and volume, which forces air in and out of the body. Because it's a muscle, it also requires oxygen so that it doesn't produce lactic acid when it works during exercise. So, if during exercise we're having to breathe more and breathe harder and breathe faster, that diaphragm muscle itself can actually fatigue with a buildup of lactic acid. And so, if we've done an aerobic training program, what can actually happen is that the respiratory muscles themselves will increase their aerobic enzymes. Remember, enzymes help speed up processes, and their oxidative capacity. They can generate greater force and improve their exercise performance. So, what we mean here is if there's less oxygen needed by those lung muscles themselves because of the aerobic enzymes and their oxidative capacity, more of that oxygen that used to be being brought in and used by the diaphragm can actually be sent to the working muscles. Therefore, at the same breathing rate, pre-training and post-training, the same amount of oxygen is going to be coming in, maybe slightly more. We are able to use more of that oxygen where we really want it, which is muscles like the calf, the quadriceps, the hamstrings, the glutes during running motion, compared to the diaphragm itself taking that oxygen to be used for breathing. With less lactate being built up in the muscles because more oxygen is there, we are able to be in the aerobic system at higher intensities and at quicker rates. So the more air that's being brought in and used by the working muscles in comparison to muscles like the diaphragm is going to mean that when we're running, we don't feel the effects of lactic acid as much. The other thing that we want to think about here is that when we breathe in the same size breath as before compared to after a training program, because the lungs are more efficient, we are able to extract more oxygen. Therefore, the diaphragm does not force us to breathe as quickly. So the air that we breathe in can sit in the lungs for a little bit longer. And because the heart is pumping the blood past the lungs, past the capillaries at the alveoli, we are able to take more oxygen out of the alveoli more quickly and more efficiently. More of that residual air that we breathe in will be able to be used in comparison to breathing out excess oxygen that we might have breathed in our pre-training mechanisms. It's a hard item to understand, but essentially, if the lungs are more efficient and more oxygen is being taken out and into the bloodstream, therefore we are not wasting a lot of the oxygen we breathe in. Now we move on to VO2, the volume of oxygen. When we say VO2, and you'll hear this a lot between now and the end of the year, and it's always on the end of your exam, VO2 is the amount of oxygen that is taken up and used by the body. So it's not just the ventilation, it's not the amount of oxygen that we're breathing in per minute or per breath with tidal volume, etc. What we're referring to here is the amount of oxygen we breathe in and use at our muscles. We'll talk about what happens, whether it increases, decreases, etc., but you can already start to see with efficiency what that means. One thing you need to note is that your body's maximum volume of oxygen consumption, VO2 max, will increase with aerobic training of about 8 to 12 weeks. So the maximum amount of oxygen that we can breathe in, transport and take down to our muscles and use, the maximum amount can increase. Our body is becoming overly more efficient due to what we already know with stroke volume and heart rate, but also because of AVO2 difference, which is actually extracting that oxygen out into the muscles. When we take the amount that the heart pushes out per beat, the amount of times the heart beats, and the amount of oxygen that's able to be extracted from the bloodstream, we are able to look at the total amount of oxygen being taken out of the bloodstream per minute. And if we look at that as a maximum with the highest amount of stroke volume, the highest amount of heart rate that we can possibly get to, with that extra AVO2 equation, we have our volume of oxygen maximum, and that will increase with an 8 to 12 week training program. What does this mean? What this means is simple. If a runner is untrained and they are trying to run at 5 minutes and 30 seconds per kilometer, their muscles, the calf, quad, hamstrings, glutes, etc., require a certain amount of ATP to be able to complete the muscle contractions required at the speed and force that we need to be able to complete 1 kilometer in 5.5 minutes. Because that intensity is high for an untrained athlete, that untrained athlete is going to be having to push their heart faster, push their heart harder, stroke volume and heart rate, trying to have to get their diaphragm to breathe in faster and breathe in harder in order to bring in enough oxygen to be able to run at 5 minutes 30 per kilometer within the aerobic energy system so we don't build up lactic acid and fatigue. When the body becomes more efficient at breathing in oxygen and transporting it and using it around the body, we don't have to breathe as fast, as deep, as hard. The heart doesn't have to work as fast, as hard, or push as strong to be able to get that same amount of oxygen down to the working muscles. And the muscles might not even need as much because they're more efficient. Therefore, we can complete the 5 minutes per 30 per kilometer at a much lower intensity for our body. The change in VO2 max is because we're better at oxygen delivery to the working muscles, and the muscles are better at extracting the oxygen. And we can see on this graph over here that somebody who is untrained, their heart rate spikes straight up, like I was just saying, to try and get a good volume of oxygen oxygen consumption. And as we train and get more efficient, we are able to keep lower heart rates and also bring in a higher oxygen consumption, therefore becoming more aerobically trained. I'll leave the video on this table here, and hopefully if you've understood what I have said in this video so far, the reasons behind increases and decreases at rest, submaximal and maximal exercise will make sense. So feel free to pause this video now, take down these changes, the chronic adaptations, and then feel free to also join the Zoom and ask me any questions.